The man known to history as Emperor Frederick Barbarossa was born in mid-December in the year 1122 in Argonaut, in what is now the region of Alsace in eastern France. He was christened simply as Frederick, and the name Barbarossa was a nickname he would acquire later in his life on account of his facial hair. Barbarossa literally means red beard in Italian. His father was Frederick II, Duke of Swabia. This was a large duchy which covered the region approximating to southwestern Germany today and straddled the borders of France, Switzerland, and Austria. The Duke was one of the heads of the Hohenstaufen family in Germany, a dynasty which was just beginning to play a major role in the politics of Europe in the High Middle Ages. His mother was Judith of Bavaria, a daughter of Henry IX, the Duke of Bavaria. She and Frederick Sr. had only recently married, and Frederick Jr. was their first child. At some unknown time in the years that followed, possibly in 1123 or 1124, she gave birth to a second child, a daughter named Bertha, also known as Judith. However, the union produced no more children, and Judith died prematurely in 1130. As a result, young Frederick had only vague memories of his birth mother and would have grown up more familiar with his stepmother, Agnes of Saarbrücken, whom Frederick Sr. married soon after Judith's death. In order to understand the course of events which would catapult young Frederick to the forefront of European politics in the second half of the 12th century, we need to look back at the often rather confusing political landscape of Europe as it evolved during the course of the Middle Ages. After the centuries of instability following the collapse of the Roman Empire in Western Europe in the 5th century AD, the king of the Franks, Charlemagne or Charles the Great, succeeded during the second half of the 8th century in building up a very substantial empire which extended throughout most of modern-day France, Switzerland, the Low Countries, much of Germany, and parts of Austria and Italy. As a result, on Christmas Day in the year 800, he was crowned in Rome by Pope Leo III as the Holy Roman Emperor, and his lands were designated as being the Holy Roman Empire, a successor state to the earlier Roman Empire, a move which was given formal sanction by the Church. This Holy Roman Empire, or Carolingian Empire, continued to be ruled by Charlemagne for some years, and although it passed intact to his son and successor Louis the Pious, when Louis died in 840, the empire was soon divided between his sons, and then, in turn, those sons divided up their lands, meaning that by the 10th century, the Holy Roman Empire and the Carolingian Empire were heavily fragmented. The Holy Roman Empire did not survive in the west of Charlemagne's empire, where the Kingdom of France emerged as a separate entity during the course of the 10th century. However, it did survive in Germany and Italy, where the title of Holy Roman Emperor passed to several families after the direct Carolingian line died out in Germany in 888. But because of the rapid division and fragmentation of the Carolingian lands throughout Germany and Italy in the 9th and 10th centuries, there were dozens of competing duchies and lordships throughout Germany by the time of Frederick's birth in the 12th century. Many of the rulers of these duchies had a claim to the title of Holy Roman Emperor. Should the male line of the Salian or Salic dynasty, which had served as Holy Roman Emperors since 1027, die out. At the time that Frederick was born, the emperor was Henry V, who had been King of Germany since 1099, and Holy Roman Emperor since 1111. His power varied across the course of his reign, as many of the more powerful dukes of Germany would often ignore his commands, while the only other major area of the former Carolingian Empire over which the Holy Roman Emperors still exercised a nominal control was Italy. But here, the many cities and towns of the north were de facto independent by the early 12th century. It was with these two regions of the former Empire of Charlemagne that Frederick's political life would be concerned. When Frederick was just 3 years old in 1125, the Holy Roman Empire was cast into turmoil when Henry V died without an heir. When this occurred, Frederick's father, the Duke of Swabia, was considered as a leading candidate to succeed as King of Germany and to seek election as Holy Roman Emperor. The Hohenstaufens were indirectly descended from the Carolingians through several centuries, and the Duchy of Swabia was a stem duchy which had emerged in the 10th century following the complicated fragmentation of the Carolingian Empire. Moreover, when Henry V had been forced to head south to Italy in one of his many clashes with the papacy in Rome for control over affairs in Italy, Frederick Sr. had often been appointed by the emperor to oversee affairs in Germany during his absence. Indeed, it is believed that Henry wished for Frederick to succeed him, but Frederick proved his own worst enemy in this regard. When the German lords and bishops met at the city of Mainz shortly after Henry's death to decide on a new emperor, Frederick alienated many with his overconfidence and unwillingness to accept free princely elections. As a result, a compromise candidate in the shape of Lothair of Supplinburg was elected to succeed as Holy Roman Emperor. It was not an arrangement that would go unchallenged for long. While all of this was occurring, young Frederick was being groomed to become a lord one day. The education of those of noble blood in the 12th century focused on preparing sons to be commanders on the battlefield. He would have learned to ride on horseback from a very young age and how to fight with a sword and other weapons. Armor would have been drafted into this training after a certain point, as the manner in which medieval knights of the 12th century fought involved wearing heavy plate and chainmail armor. All of this came at the expense of what we would view as a normal education nowadays. Many rulers had been illiterate in the early Middle Ages, and while this situation was improving by the 12th century, literacy was still not prioritized. There has been some considerable debate as to how well Frederick could read and write, and while we can probably dismiss earlier claims that he was illiterate, he was no scholar king either, and he had very little grasp of Latin, the language of scholarship, the law, and the church in the High Middle Ages. Thus, Frederick was raised to rule on the battlefield rather than from behind a desk. In 1137, when Frederick was heading into his late teenage years, the stability of the Holy Roman Empire was once again called into question. That December, Lothair III died. He had only one surviving child, a daughter named Gertrude, and the succession was consequently cast into fresh chaos. As a result, Frederick's uncle, Conrad, the Duke of Franconia, now moved to make himself King of Germany and Holy Roman Emperor. Conrad had a long history of seeking the imperial crown. He had challenged Lothair's position back in 1127 and had been declared as a rival emperor, and now the opportunity presented by the imperial throne lying vacant made him the obvious candidate. At a meeting of the German princes and bishops at Koblenz in March 1138, he was elected emperor. However, he faced opposition himself from Henry the Proud, Duke of Bavaria and Saxony. This was the origin of a split within the Holy Roman Empire between the supporters of the House of Welf, of which Henry the Proud was the head, and the House of Hohenstaufen, from which Conrad and Frederick hailed. Eventually, these two camps would become known as the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. The Guelphs is an Italian rendering of Welf, while Ghibellines is an Italianized form of Weiblingen, the name of the ancestral seat or stronghold of the House of Hohenstaufen in Württemberg in Germany. The split between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines would shape much of Frederick's later life. Conrad would rule as Holy Roman Emperor, albeit with some opposition from the House of Welf or Guelphs throughout the 1140s. Frederick's path, though, in these years lay elsewhere. By the early 1140s, Frederick was emerging as a substantial character within Germany as he entered his adult years. He sat at several Hoftages or imperial assemblies under his uncle's rule at various German cities between 1141 and 1145. By this time, the distinctive red beard which he came to be known for was visible. However, Frederick's destiny in the second half of the 1140s was not shaped by events in Germany or Italy, but by occurrences much further away. All the way back in 1095, Pope Urban II had preached of the need for a crusade or holy war to the Holy Land to reclaim Jerusalem for Christianity from the Muslims who had conquered the region. The first crusade between 1096 and 1099 had been extremely successful, resulting in the establishment of several Crusader states around Jerusalem, Antioch, and other cities, including a newly established Kingdom of Jerusalem. However, in 1144, a Muslim ruler of the Middle East called Imad al-Din Zengi reconquered the city of Edessa from the Christians. This led a leading churchman, Bernard of Clairvaux, to preach on the need for a second crusade to be undertaken while he was visiting the city of Speyer in 1146. Frederick would soon be involved. Unlike the First Crusade, which was led by several leading nobles but did not involve any of Europe's major monarchs, the Second Crusade was soon joined by the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad III and the King of France, Louis VII. Frederick took the cross himself, a symbolic gesture which indicated the intention to go on crusade early in 1147, and committed himself to travelling with his uncle to the Holy Land. This was despite the objections of his father, the Duke of Swabia, who was dying and wanted his son and heir to remain in Germany to cement his control over the duchy when he passed away. In the event, Frederick Sr. died early in April 1147, and Frederick succeeded him before he ever left for the Holy Land. Thus, when Frederick led Swabia's contingent from the city of Regensburg in late May 1147 off towards the Holy Land, he did so as Duke of Swabia, and they did so along with contingents of tens of thousands of other crusaders who set off from various places around Europe. Some headed by sea from England and won a notable victory before they ever left Europe by landing on the Iberian Peninsula and conquering Lisbon from the Muslims there for Portugal. Most, though, headed by land, and by the late summer of 1147 were crossing through the Byzantine Empire, ready to make their descent on the Holy Land. The journey through the Byzantine Empire and then Turkey proved a pivotal episode in the Second Crusade. As they were passing through the empire's lands in the southeast of the Balkans towards the city of Constantinople, flash floods ravaged the Crusader camps in early September. Significant damage had been inflicted on Conrad and Frederick's forces as a result of this, and this was compounded in the weeks that followed as they passed over the Bosphorus and into Anatolia in what is now western Turkey. For weeks in the autumn of 1147, the German armies were confronted by raids and ambushes on their forces by the Turks of the region. Eventually, frustrated in their efforts, they sent messages ahead to the French under Louis VII to request his aid. The French subsequently joined up with the German Crusaders, but when Conrad himself fell sick, the combined forces retreated back to Constantinople. Consequently, it was a demoralized Crusader force which left Constantinople in ships acquired from Emperor Manuel I Comnenus, the Byzantine emperor, having abandoned their plans to march overland. Thus Frederick, Conrad and their German Crusaders finally arrived to the Holy Land, where they sailed into the port town of Acre on the 11th of April 1148. This trip to the Holy Land had been an inauspicious beginning to the Second Crusade. It was compounded when they learned that King Louis's French forces, which had stubbornly maintained their overland march through Turkey, had been all but wiped out along the way. Louis had arrived in Antioch a few weeks earlier with the remains of his army, but they could now offer little to the military capabilities of the Second Crusade. Having learned this news, Conrad and Frederick proceeded from Acre to Jerusalem to visit the holy places and consult with the King of Jerusalem, King Baldwin III. A decision was taken at this juncture to hold a major council of the European kings and their lords, with the lords and rulers of the Crusader state at Acre in midsummer 1148. At the resulting Council of Acre, held at Palmyra just outside the city on the 24th of June 1148, a decision was taken to effectively change the goals of the Second Crusade. The crusade had been called for the purpose of reclaiming the city of Edessa from the Muslims, but now the loftier target of seizing Damascus, the capital of the Burid Emirate, which ruled much of Syria at the time, was decided upon. This was a dangerous decision, given that their forces were already much depleted from the losses they had suffered on their journey to the Holy Land. In the weeks that followed, the European monarchs and lords and the heads of the Crusader states gathered their forces in preparation for the siege. Modern estimates of the combined forces which they advanced from Tiberias against Damascus in mid-July have suggested a possible army of 50,000 men, but the likely number was probably considerably smaller. And it is important to note that the bulk of the troops were comprised of recruits from the Crusader states themselves, rather than the European Crusader armies, which had been so depleted by the attempt to travel through Turkey. They arrived outside Damascus on the 23rd of July. What followed was a fiasco. Damascus was surrounded in the 12th century by vast orchards, which limited visibility on the approach to the city, and as they tried to near the walls, the Crusader forces faced constant hit-and-run attacks by the more mobile Burid cavalry. Over the next several days, tactical errors mounted on the part of the Crusaders and a dispute broke out between rival contenders over who would rule Damascus, if by some miracle they captured it. As a result, on the 28th of July, just 5 days after initiating the siege, Conrad and Frederick took their forces back towards Jerusalem and the siege was abandoned. The disaster at Damascus did not immediately bring the Second Crusade to an end. Back at Jerusalem, plans were initiated to launch an attack on the smaller city of Ascalon, and Conrad and Frederick started off with their troops to head there, but quit the enterprise when it became clear that no coordinated response would come from the other Crusaders. And with this, the Second Crusade was over, a costly and complete failure in terms of achieving its goals in the Holy Land. Although King Louis VII of France remained behind in Jerusalem until 1149, Conrad and Frederick made for Constantinople with what remained of their forces in late 1148. On the way, at Thessaloniki in Greece, they reconfirmed an agreement which Conrad had reached with Emperor Manuel of Byzantium while in Constantinople the previous year. This was a deal whereby both sides would ally together to attack the Norman Kingdom of Sicily, which ruled the island itself and much of the southern mainland of Italy. This was a part of Europe which would feature significantly in Frederick's own rule in the years to come. And with this agreement made, Frederick left Conrad and headed off in haste through the Balkans to Swabia, where he needed to shore up his own rule, having left so soon after he succeeded to the duchy in 1147. Back in Germany, Frederick set about consolidating his rule over Swabia. He might have remained a simple duke here for the next several decades, had it not been for events in the months that followed. In 1150, Henry Berengar, Conrad's eldest son, died. He had another child, also called Frederick, but this boy was just 5 years old at the time. Thus, Henry's death in 1150 opened the possibility of the succession descending elsewhere should Conrad die in the near future. And that is exactly what happened. In early 1152, Conrad, who was nearly 60, a ripe old age by the standards of the 12th century, fell ill. And when he died on the 15th of February 1152 at Bamberg in Bavaria, there were just 2 individuals by his deathbed, the Prince Bishop of Bamberg, Eberhard II, and Frederick Barbarossa. We will never know if the tale Frederick and Eberhard emerged from the scene of Conrad's death with was true or not, but it would come to have enormous significance. Conrad, Frederick claimed, had chosen him to be his successor on his deathbed, rather than his 6-year-old son. Whether it was true or not, the lords and electors of Germany wanted to believe it, in order to avoid the chaos that would ensue from a long minority reign. Accordingly, Frederick was quickly designated as the next king of Germany, and crowned as King of the Romans at Aachen on the 9th of March 1152. This effectively made him the Holy Roman Emperor. However, he would have to wait some time for the formal coronation. Frederick quickly made clear his intention to revitalize the Holy Roman Empire and the position of the emperors. For decades, the imperial title had been weakening. In Germany, there were over 1,000 separate political entities, all of which were nominally under the overall rule of the emperor, but which in reality generally paid little more than token recognition to the emperors. Some amongst the Guelphs were openly hostile to the Ghibelline emperors, such as Conrad had been, and Frederick now was. In Italy, the other major area where the Holy Roman Empire still held some sway, Frederick would face opposition from Roger II of Sicily, whose powerful Norman kingdom in the south of Italy would conduct raids further north with impunity. More significantly, the emperors had been weakened in their authority as a result of what was known as the investiture controversy in the late 11th and early 12th centuries. This was a dispute which had arisen between the papacy and the emperors over whether Rome or the current emperor had the right to appoint bishops and archbishops in Germany and Italy. The papacy had won the argument, but it had created a rift between Rome and the emperors. As a result, Conrad had never actually been crowned in Rome as Holy Roman Emperor, and the many cities and towns of northern and central Italy had begun to exercise increasing independence, so that by the time Frederick became emperor in 1152, imperial control over the Kingdom of Italy had diminished almost entirely. All of these issues confronted Frederick when he became emperor in 1152, but he quickly took steps to strengthen his position. Just months later, in 1153, he reached an agreement with Pope Eugenius III, known as the Treaty of Constance. Under the terms of this, Frederick promised to help prevent any efforts by the Byzantine Empire to re-establish itself in Italy, and also to help Eugenius to gain control of Rome again. The Pope had spent much of his pontificate since 1145 at Farfa Abbey, north of the Eternal City, as Rome itself had been taken over by a body of citizens led by Arnold of Brescia, a religious radical who established the Commune of Rome as a patrician government. In return, Frederick affirmed his claim to become the emperor and was attempting to indicate that he did not need papal approval in order to become the legitimate Holy Roman Emperor. Moreover, he was further facilitated in the months that followed by the death of Roger II of Sicily. He was succeeded by his son William, who was not necessarily an ineffective ruler, but was not the equal of his father, who had been one of the most dynamic and energetic rulers of 12th century Europe. Once the Treaty of Constance had been agreed, Frederick began preparing his forces for a campaign into Italy. His actions in the peninsula and how they related to his control over Germany and relationships with successive popes would come to dominate Barbarossa's reign. The country at this time was a patchwork of different political entities, which was almost as confusing as 12th century Germany's political landscape. In the south, the Kingdom of Sicily, which covered the island itself and much of the peninsula south of Rome, was the dominant power. Elsewhere, a number of states, such as the Republic of Venice in the northeast of the country, were also independent, but much of central Italy and the north in the plain of Lombardy was nominally part of the Kingdom of Italy. This was another constituent part of what had been the Carolingian Empire hundreds of years earlier, but which had also fragmented as Germany had. Thus, it included cities such as Rome, Milan, Mantua, Bologna, Florence, Genoa, and Turin, which theoretically owed some allegiance to the Holy Roman Emperor, but which, as we have seen, were independent in all but name by the mid-12th century, and were governed as city-states by their own communes of wealthier citizens. Now, shortly after ascending as emperor, Frederick's mission was to re-establish imperial authority across the peninsula. Frederick began reasserting himself in Italy with an intended campaign against the Normans in the south in the autumn of 1154. With Roger II just having died and the country adjusting to a new ruler, Barbarossa believed this was the time to strike the powerful Kingdom of Sicily. However, no sooner had he arrived into the plain of Lombardy with a field army of about 7,000 men, including 1,800 knights, than he realized exactly how unwilling to obey his commands the cities of the Kingdom of Italy were. Consequently, he immediately changed tactic and instead began a military campaign against the northern cities, forcing Milan to submit to him that winter and completely destroying the town of Tortona in the Piedmont in northwestern Italy. Then he proceeded towards the city of Pavia, from where the Holy Roman Emperors had long based their rule in the Kingdom of Italy to avoid jurisdictional overlaps with the papacy in Rome. Here, Frederick was formally crowned as King of Italy on the 24th of April 1155. With this done, he campaigned further south through Florence and Bologna, all the time making it clear that he intended to exercise greater control of the Italian cities than they had seen from a Holy Roman Emperor in some time. With his control over the north of Italy reimposed, Frederick continued on south to fulfill his promises to Pope Adrian as part of the Treaty of Constance. Thus, in early June, he arrived in Rome, where he had Arnold of Brescia, the religious radical leader there, executed. Then Pope Adrian entered the city and formally crowned Barbarossa as the Holy Roman Emperor on the 18th of June 1155. Even as riots were occurring across the city in opposition to the reimposition of imperial and papal rule. In the hours that followed, Frederick's troops restored order to the city, but by that time there were over 1,000 Romans dead on the streets as a result of the unrest, and thereafter Frederick proceeded south with the goal of finally campaigning against the Normans. yet reinforcements which he had been promised by the German lords never arrived. Consequently, he returned to Germany late in 1155, bringing his first Italian campaign to an end. His goal was now to strengthen his position in Germany before attempting a second campaign in Italy. This he duly achieved by placating the leading lord of the Welfs or Guelphs in Germany, Henry the Lion, by granting him the Duchy of Bavaria in 1156. This made Henry the second most powerful lord in Germany, next to Barbarossa himself. But in doing so, Frederick galvanized the support of the German lords in advance of a new campaign into Italy. Thanks to our sponsor, Trade Coffee. They sell the freshest, most ethically sourced beans from America's best local roasters. Plus, they ship them to you free, either whole or ground, as you prefer. Did you know that 90% of coffee from grocery stores is actually stale? So, instead of buying the same old stale coffee, let Trade Coffee deliver freshly roasted coffee that you're literally guaranteed to love. Trade's real coffee experts personally taste test over 450 roasts so that they know exactly what to recommend for you. All you have to do is answer a few questions on their site. That's what we did, and we got the sweetest, tastiest roast that was Equator's Sumatra Queen Katiara Fairtrade Organic. That roast produces an amazing cup of coffee, definitely fit for any queen. Right now, Trade is offering a total of $20 off your first 3 bags when you go to www.drinktrade.com/peopleprofiles or click the link in the description below. That's more than 16 cups of coffee for free. To get started, take their quiz at www.drinktrade.com/peopleprofiles. That's www.drinktrade.com/peopleprofiles for $20 off your first 3 bags. It was also in 1156 that Frederick entered into his second and more substantial marriage. Barbarossa had married much earlier, in 1147, prior to his departure from Germany on the Second Crusade, to Adelaide of Wolburg, a daughter of the Bavarian Margrave Leopold III of Wolburg. But the union proved unsatisfactory. It did not lead to children, and Adelaide was suspected of adultery during Frederick's absence in the Holy Land. Accordingly, an annulment was secured in 1153. Then, 3 years later, Frederick married Beatrice of Burgundy, the only surviving child of Renaud III, the Count of Burgundy, as his second wife. As a result, Frederick became co-ruler of the County of Burgundy, an acquisition which provided him with lands strategically located north of the plain of Lombardy in northern Italy. These could now be used as a way to campaign into Italy without having to rely exclusively on bringing his forces over the Alps through the Brenner Pass. The marriage proved happy by the standards of the time, and after several years it also resulted in 11 children between 1162 and 1179. 8 of these were boys, so there would be no question of Frederick not having a surviving heir when he died. With his position in Germany at least temporarily strengthened and having acquired the further boon of control over Burgundy through his marriage, Frederick undertook his second Italian campaign in the summer of 1158, with the goal of further consolidating his hold on the Kingdom of Italy, and then invading the Kingdom of Sicily. This time he was accompanied by Henry the Lion and enjoyed much greater support from the German lords as a consequence. As a result, when they descended into the plain of Lombardy that summer, Barbarossa's forces quickly crushed a fresh bout of unrest in the city of Milan, the leading city in the north of Italy. Following this, an imperial diet or parliament was convened at Roncaglia near Piacenza. Here, Frederick made it clear that he intended to re-establish imperial authority across Italy, and further efforts to acquire independence by cities such as Milan would only result in fresh military campaigns by him. The warning was not heeded, however, and rebellions sprung up across the north of Italy in the months that followed, notably at the city of Crema, where Frederick spent much of the rest of his second Italian campaign engaged in a siege in 1159. It was while Frederick was engaged in the siege of Crema in 1159 that Pope Adrian IV died. This would have major consequences for the next 20 years of Italian politics, as, at a papal conclave which followed, the favoured candidate amongst the cardinals was unquestionably Roland of Siena, a cardinal and the papal chancellor. But there was a problem with this proposed candidate. Roland was an avowed opponent of Frederick's, who had consistently argued throughout the 1150s that the Holy Roman Emperor was a vassal of the papacy and took his commands from Rome, not the other way around as Barbarossa wanted it. Therefore, when the papal conclave elected Roland and he became Pope Alexander III, Frederick moved to have his closest rival, a Ghibelline candidate, Octavian of Monticelli, elected. Octavian was duly elected by a minority of the cardinals and became Pope Victor IV. Victor was the first of three so-called anti-popes, the others being Pascal III from 1164 and Calixtus III from 1168. These were popes who were not legally elected by a majority of cardinals, but who were set up by Frederick as rivals to Alexander III during his long pontificate down to 1181. Thus, Frederick effectively shattered the harmony of the Church in Italy for 22 years following Alexander's election as Pope, as a means of keeping this opponent of imperial authority from having full control of the papacy. The immediate consequences were that Pope Alexander now moved to ally the papacy with the Kingdom of Sicily against any further incursions by Frederick against Rome or the south of the Italian peninsula. They also began fomenting further unrest in the north, and this was at least partially responsible for a new revolt by Milan in the early 1160s. A lengthy siege followed in 1161 and early 1162, following which the Milanese finally surrendered on the 6th of March 1162, unhappy at having become bogged down in northern Italy for nearly 4 years when his goal all along had been to strike against the Kingdom of Sicily. Frederick exerted a heavy revenge on Milan for having revolted 3 times under his rule already. When the city was entered in early March, his army set about destroying much of it in the hours that followed. The example this set led several other cities across the north, such as Brescia and Placentia, which had also revolted, to surrender, actions which brought to an end Barbarossa's second Italian campaign. Thereafter, he briefly returned to Germany, but it would not be long before fresh unrest arose to the south. It was not all war for Frederick. His reign was also central to what is known as the 12th century Renaissance. This was an early period of political, social, cultural, and intellectual revival throughout Europe following the Dark Ages, which had followed the fall of the Roman Empire. This early Renaissance saw many marked advancements in these fields, which are now seen as being necessary precursors to the later, more well-known Italian Renaissance, which spread throughout Europe throughout the 16th century. One of the foremost elements of this earlier 12th century Renaissance was the emergence of Europe's first universities. These typically emerged where groups of students pooled their financial resources together to hire scholars to teach them. The first such university to emerge anywhere in Europe was in the Italian city of Bologna. Some studies place the foundation date to 1088, but what is generally agreed is that the university here was given a formal foundation in 1158, when, at the beginning of his second Italian campaign, Frederick issued what is known as the Authentica Abita, a document which set out for the first time what the rights and responsibilities of both the students and teachers at the University of Bologna were. This was a highly important formalization of the university here, and in the early 13th century, the model provided by Bologna was imitated by the universities of Oxford and Cambridge in England, Paris in France, Salamanca in Spain, and Padua in Italy. Another element of this 12th century Renaissance which was characteristic of Frederick's reign was the revival in interest in different forms of legal systems. During the medieval period, the legal systems of kingdoms such as England and France and other entities, such as the Holy Roman Empire, had come to increasingly be a combination of canon law or church law and the common law, which was effectively a distillation of earlier Germanic laws and the Roman civil law. However, during Frederick's reign, there was renewed interest in different legal systems, with an increasing number of lawyers being hired by governments such as Frederick's. Thus, there was a revival of interest in the Roman civil law at Frederick's court, and also alternative legal systems such as the Justinian Code, a legal code which had been developed by the early 6th century Byzantine Emperor Justinian. Much of this revival was purely motivated by self-interest on Frederick's part, as he sought to use legal arguments to justify his attempts to have greater jurisdiction than the papacy in Rome over parts of Italy. But it is significant that it was revived as a result of Frederick's reign, and the Roman civil law went on to fundamentally influence the legal systems of modern Europe in due course. It is interesting to speculate, given these administrative and educational reforms, how Barbarossa's reign might have developed had he not engaged in determined efforts throughout it to re-establish imperial control over Italy. But ultimately, his attentions were focused on the southern peninsula. No sooner had he returned to Germany in 1162, after his second Italian campaign, than he was planning a third for 1163. This one again aimed at finally campaigning against William I of Sicily in the south. However, the third Italian campaign would yet again be diverted following the emergence of a new independence movement in the urban communes at Verona and neighboring cities in the northeast, and this time Frederick was unable to suppress these, in the same way that he had the revolt of the early 1060s, by making an example of Milan. This is because the insurrection was more coordinated, with the cities of Verona, Padua, and Vicenza allying themselves into what was known as the Veronese League, which also acquired the aid of the independent and powerful Republic of Venice. As a result, Frederick was unable to tame them immediately following his entry into Italy in 1163, and instead cut the third Italian campaign short. He returned to Germany and began preparing a fourth, larger expedition. The fourth Italian campaign, which Frederick led south through the Brenner Pass and into Italy in 1166, was a more formidable affair than the third campaign a few years earlier. And this time, Barbarossa had a different approach. Rather than striking at the cities of the Veronese League and other recalcitrant elements amongst the cities of the plain of Lombardy, he would pass through the north entirely and move against Rome and Pope Alexander III, whom he believed was the major prop holding together the rebellious cities in the north. Frederick was also doubtlessly perturbed by rumors that the Byzantine Emperor Manuel I had sent emissaries to Alexander offering to end the Great Schism which had developed between the Roman Catholic Church in the west and the Greek Orthodox Church in the east, over several significant doctrinal and procedural differences between the two churches, if the Pope would recognize Manuel's rights to land which had previously belonged to the Roman Empire in Italy and elsewhere. If Alexander was so inclined, then Manuel would send aid to Italy to help the Pope in his struggle with Frederick. Thus, Barbarossa had more reasons than one to strike against the papacy in 1166. The fourth Italian campaign, like the third campaign a few years earlier, ran into stalemate. Frederick proceeded south and captured Rome after victory outside the city at the Battle of Monte Porzio on the 29th of May 1167. Alexander now fled south to the Kingdom of Sicily and found refuge at the city of Benevento, while Frederick imposed the anti-pope Paschal III in Rome. However, this victory soon turned to despair. Disease struck Frederick's forces in Rome, most likely an outbreak of malaria, severely reducing his military capacity. Then, news arrived from the north that while he was capturing Rome, the Veronese League there had expanded to include nearly every city and town in the plain of Lombardy, including Milan, Genoa, Bologna, Crema, Cremona, Mantua, Piacenza, Brescia, Modena, Parma, and Ferrara. Leading members of the communes of these cities and towns had sworn an oath at the Abbey of Pontida near Bergamo by the Italian Alps on the 7th of April 1167, creating this new Lombard League. As new members joined every week, and with his own forces ravaged by the outbreak of malaria in Rome, Frederick now decided to postpone his showdown with the Italian cities and return to Germany in 1168. It would be 6 years before he returned for the final showdown. Frederick spent the late 1160s and the early 1170s undertaking reforms elsewhere to strengthen his position in advance of a new campaign into Italy. For instance, economic changes of a kind were made, particularly in the proliferation of mints throughout Central Europe to produce imperial coins. There were just 24 of these in all of Germany at the start of his reign in the early 1150s, but by the 1180s, well over 100 could be found in the same region. He also made efforts to strengthen imperial authority to the east of the Holy Roman Empire, around Bohemia and Hungary, two regions which had been expanding in the 12th century into the Balkans and western Poland. For instance, when a dispute arose in the Kingdom of Bohemia over the succession there in the early 1170s, Barbarossa convened a diet at the German town of Helmsdorf in September 1173, where he championed the cause of Uldrich, a son of the former king Sobislav I. Admittedly, Uldrich did not want the crown and immediately abdicated in favor of his brother Sobislav, who then became Sobislav II, a decision which temporarily seemed to stabilize the situation in Bohemia, although fresh unrest arose in the mid-1170s. By the time that the latter unrest arose in Bohemia, Frederick had already turned his attentions back southwards towards Italy. In 1174, he undertook his fifth Italian campaign, the last major military foray into the peninsula of his reign. For this, he brought an army of over 10,000 troops south from Germany. However, he faced an unprecedented alliance of the Lombard League, the papacy, and the Kingdom of Sicily, with some minor support provided by the Byzantine Empire. At first, it seemed possible that direct conflict could be avoided as negotiations were opened between Barbarossa and the Lombard League at the city of Pavia, but these broke down in the summer of 1175. Months of movements across the plain of Lombardy followed as the League was able to gather an army of in excess of 20,000 men, while Frederick sent north to Burgundy and various parts of Germany, requesting further detachments to be sent south. The reinforcements he received did not meet his expectations, and when the Imperial and League forces finally clashed at the Battle of Legnano on the 29th of May 1176 to the northwest of Milan, Frederick suffered the worst military defeat of his life. The emperor was struck from his horse himself during the conflict and wounded, to the extent that it was briefly believed he was dead. Frederick's defeat at the Battle of Legnano was the turning point in the Italian wars he had engaged in for 20 years. He now accepted that he would have to reach an agreement with the communes and nobles of the northern cities. He had realized that he could not overwhelm them and force them into complete submission as he had set out to do 20 years earlier. But at the same time, the Italian communes of the north knew that they would have to acknowledge some imperial oversight of northern Italy, and they could not go back to the de facto independence they had held for much of the first half of the 12th century. Accordingly, negotiations were entered into between Frederick and the League, with Alexander III sending emissaries from Rome. The result was the Treaty of Venice, which was agreed to at the Trading Republic City on the 22nd of July, 1177. The treaty did not bring about a full resolution to the showdown between the Italian cities and Frederick, but largely concluded that a 6-year truce would hold between the emperor and the League. In the meantime, negotiations for a fuller, more long-lasting understanding would continue. The Treaty of Venice brought to an end Frederick's military campaigning in Italy, but while he had technically lost the war with the defeat at Legnano, in the end he gained a partial victory in the peace. When the 6-year truce concluded, it was replaced by a new diplomatic arrangement, which was signed at Lake Constance on the 25th of June 1183. The Peace of Constance was a major compromise. The cities and towns of the Kingdom of Italy would henceforth be allowed to manage much of their internal affairs themselves, but they agreed to acknowledge Frederick's imperial claims on northern and much of central Italy. They would owe fealty to Frederick, who would have the right of appointment of some of the senior officials in each city. Office holders throughout the communes would also have to swear an oath of fealty to the emperor, and while the court systems would operate independently in each city or town, citizens there could appeal to the imperial court in Germany if they so wished. Thus, the Peace of Constance guaranteed the Italian cities a substantial degree of internal independence. But Frederick, after nearly 30 years of conflict in Italy, had succeeded in re-establishing a much greater degree of control over the region than many of his near predecessors as emperor had enjoyed. With the wars over in Italy, Frederick was able to turn his attention yet again to Germany, where he sought revenge against those who had failed to adequately reinforce him in 1175 and 1176 before the defeat at Legnano. In particular, he was determined to move against Henry the Lion, the Welf or Guelph leader to whom he had granted the Duchy of Bavaria back in 1156 in order to quell unrest amongst the Welf faction at that time. Henry had failed to support his fifth Italian campaign adequately and had also aroused some enmity within Germany at his accumulation of huge tracts of land. As a result, Frederick was able to place Henry on trial in 1180 on the grounds that imperial law held sway over traditional German law and that Henry could be tried on charges brought by an emperor. Henry refused to appear at the trial and was quickly found guilty in absentia. Frederick then invaded his lands in Saxony, and Henry was eventually forced to submit in November 1181. Shortly afterwards, he was driven into exile for 3 years, which he spent in northern France. Thereafter, he returned to Germany and tried to re-establish himself, but he never regained the authority he had held prior to 1180. Moreover, with the death of Pope Alexander III in August 1181, Frederick found another adversary gone from the scene. If an indication of Frederick's position as the strongest Holy Roman Emperor which Europe had seen for some time were needed, then one was provided in May 1184 when Barbarossa summoned an imperial diet to assemble at the city of Mainz in western Germany on Pentecost. The Diet of Pentecost, as it has become known, saw the great lords of the empire assemble by the river Main there from the 20th of May onwards. Several banquets and ceremonies were held, and there was talk of developing an anti-French alliance with England by the German lords to re-extend imperial control over eastern France. The Diet was widely written about at the time and celebrated for its indication of how Barbarossa had rejuvenated the empire, and a further victory soon followed. In 1186, Frederick managed, despite papal objections, to engineer the marriage of his son, Henry, to Constance of Sicily, a posthumously born daughter of King Roger II of Sicily. This opened the possibility of the Hohenstaufens one day having a claim to the throne of the Kingdom of Sicily, a possibility which, if realized, would see the family and Ghibelline influence extend from Sicily north to the Baltic Sea. And so, the victories which had so often escaped Frederick on the battlefield were accumulating through diplomacy in the 1180s. It was, though, the call of the battlefield which still appealed to Frederick. In 1187, just after he had organized the Sicilian marriage, that call came yet again from the east. The Crusader states were in fresh trouble there. A dynastic crisis had broken out in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, following the death of King Baldwin IV in 1185. The problem was compounded by the fact that the disparate Muslim kingdoms of Syria and Egypt, which were often divided amongst themselves, had been united under a new Muslim leader from Kurdistan. His name was Yusuf ibn Ayyub, but he is better known as Saladin, meaning the goodness or righteousness of the faith. In July 1187, his forces won a great victory at the Battle of Hattin, near the city of Tiberias, against a Crusader army where over 10,000 Christian soldiers are believed to have lost their lives or been captured. With the fighting forces decimated, the Crusaders were unable to prevent Saladin from continuing onwards to Jerusalem and recapturing the city after nearly a century in Christian hands. The call now went out from the remaining Crusader states. Help was needed from Europe if they were to survive and retake Jerusalem. And when word reached 67-year-old Frederick Barbarossa, he determined to take the cross again and return to the Holy Land 40 years after his last foray there. Preparations commenced in April 1188 and were to continue throughout the empire for the next year. Frederick would be joined by several senior lords, the most notable being Richard the Lionheart, a prince of England, who would soon become its king following King Henry II of England's death in the summer of 1189. King Philip II of France also took the cross, as did several of Frederick's senior lords such as his son, the Duke of Swabia, Frederick VI, and Leopold V of Austria. With Europe's three most powerful states, England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, in support of it, the Third Crusade was formidable. Barbarossa's contingent alone would constitute upwards of 15,000 soldiers, at least 3,000 of which were knights. Beyond these military preparations, diplomatic envoys were also sent out to the various powers in the Balkans and even the Seljuk Turks of the region around modern-day Turkey, with the goal of securing safe routeways to the Holy Land from Europe. There could be no repeat of the arduous journey from Constantinople to Jerusalem during the Second Crusade, where the Crusaders had been massively depleted before they ever arrived to Acre and Antioch. With all this in place, Frederick took the staff of a pilgrim at his birthplace of Haguenau on the 15th of April 1189 and set out for the Holy Land. Despite the Crusaders' best efforts to ensure a safer passage this time, Frederick would never make it to the Holy Land. The journey through the Balkans and the Byzantine Empire into Anatolia was relatively smooth, though slow. By the summer of 1190, they were in southern Turkey, making their way along the coast towards Mersin, after which they would soon turn south towards Jerusalem. When a shortcut was proposed to Frederick along the Salef River, he took the advice offered to him, but it was a fatal mistake. There are varying accounts of exactly what happened, but all are clear that Frederick drowned in the Salef River near Silifke Castle on the 10th of June 1190. Some suggest that he was weighed down by his armor after falling from his horse, others that he tried to traverse the river. What is clear is that he died, and once he did, much of the German contingent melted away and returned to Europe. Thus it was a much reduced force which his son Frederick led on to the Holy Land, where they variously buried his bones and flesh in Antioch and Tyre. There they joined up with the other Crusaders who had arrived by sea. Over the next 2 years, they would fight Saladin to a stalemate, never recovering Jerusalem, but forcing the Muslim lord to allow safe passage of Christians to the city. The Holy Roman Empire was weakened in the long run by Frederick's death. He had rejuvenated it and made it strong again after decades of internal strife and political decline during the first half of the 12th century. His eldest surviving son, Henry, succeeded him as Holy Roman Emperor in 1191, following the receipt of news that Barbarossa had died on the way to the Holy Land. Henry VI, as he became, was an effective emperor who built on his father's successes. In 1194, he claimed the throne of the Kingdom of Sicily by right of his marriage to Constance in 1186, and thereafter he even went to war against the Byzantine Empire and extracted a vassalage tax from Constantinople. But Henry died prematurely, possibly of malaria, in September 1197, and this development opened up a period of renewed conflict within the empire. Philip of Swabia, another of Barbarossa's sons, was elected as Holy Roman Emperor in 1198, but a rival contender emerged from the Welf faction in the shape of Otto of Brunswick. Accordingly, for the next 11 years, there were 2 rival emperors, before Philip's death saw Otto become the only unchallenged Welf or Guelph emperor of the High Middle Ages. Henry VI's son, named Frederick after his grandfather, managed to reacquire the imperial title in 1215 and created a strong centralized state much like Barbarossa had 40 years earlier. But his death in 1250 ushered in a renewed period of decline. Thereafter, the Kingdom of Sicily passed to the French House of Anjou in 1266, and imperial authority in Italy slowly collapsed in the late 13th century as fully independent republics began to emerge in Milan, Florence, Genoa, and other cities. Frederick Barbarossa, of course, has had a modern-day afterlife. When the forces of Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, they did so following the plans laid down in what was known as Operation Barbarossa. This blueprint for the conquest of Eastern Europe was variously named Operation Otto and Operation Fritz during the planning stage. However, in the months before the invasion was undertaken, it was renamed Operation Barbarossa at the directive of Adolf Hitler. Hitler seems to have wished to use the name for 2 reasons. Firstly, he believed that it was fitting because Barbarossa had sought to establish a militarily and administratively strong German empire during the 12th century after the Holy Roman Empire had been weakened for several decades, similar to how Germany had been weakened through its defeat in the First World War. Secondly, the Nazis believed Barbarossa had an acute interest in expanding Germany eastwards. But while Christian Europe was certainly expanding into the Baltic Sea region and further east during the 12th century, it was a complete misconception to believe that Frederick Barbarossa had been at the forefront of this eastwards march. Rather, as the foregoing has demonstrated, his primary concern was always with Germany and Italy and the rejuvenation of imperial power there. Frederick Barbarossa is a paradoxical figure and one whose career can be difficult to assess given the sheer complexity of the Holy Roman Empire in Germany and Italy during the 12th century. A casual observer could conclude that his reign was not very successful at all. For instance, his near 40-year term as emperor was bookended on either side by the Second Crusade in the late 1140s and the Third Crusade in the late 1180s. The first of these was a failure when judged by any criteria and achieved nothing in the Holy Land other than a failed siege of Damascus, which lasted less than a week. The Third Crusade was much more successful overall, but Frederick never made it to the Holy Land himself. At home, he was often even less successful. The paramount concern of his reign was to re-establish imperial control over the Kingdom of Italy, and he launched 5 campaigns into the plain of Lombardy between the mid-1150s and the mid-1170s to try to achieve that. Eventually, at the end of these, he was effectively defeated by the Lombard League at the Battle of Legnano in 1176. His loftier, earlier ambition to conquer the Kingdom of Sicily was never even really attempted because his attentions were always on the north of Italy. However, to assess Frederick Barbarossa's career in this way would be to overlook his accomplishments. When he effectively became Holy Roman Emperor in 1152, following his election as King of Germany, the empire had been weakened by decades of decline. Germany was divided between the Welfs and Hohenstaufen factions, or Guelphs and Ghibellines, as they have more popularly become known, and imperial control over the Kingdom of Italy had all but vanished in the wake of the investiture controversy and the clash with the Pope. As a result, the many cities and towns of northern and central Italy were all but independent city-states, ruled by their own communes. Frederick changed all of that. By reaching an accommodation with many of the Welf lords in Germany, he galvanized imperial control over the country, and by engaging in a relentless campaign to wear the Italian cities down between the 1150s and the 1170s, he re-established a degree of imperial rule over the Kingdom of Italy under the terms of the Peace of Constance in 1183. Near the end of his life, he also ensured that his son would become the King of Sicily by marrying Henry to Constance. However, there was one major flaw in all of this. While Frederick was able to revive imperial power in Germany and Italy during his reign, the settlement he reached in both countries relied on strong imperial rule for it to be maintained. When weaker rulers came along after himself and his grandson Frederick II, ultimately the process of political fragmentation in Germany and Italy and the decline of imperial rule recommenced. What do you think of Frederick Barbarossa? Was he a great medieval monarch, or were his accomplishments somewhat illusory? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.